Welcome everyone, I'm your host, Emerson Green. This episode is brought to you by the patrons of Walden Pod. I will soon be shuttering the podcast doors over at Counter Apologetics, which is where the majority of my Patreon support comes from. So soon the show will just be supported by listeners through patreon.com/WaldenPod and one-time donations. So today, I think there's something here for everybody. If you haven't explored the zombie argument before, or any conceivability arguments, I think you'll be able to follow what's happening. And if you're already familiar with this sort of argument, I think there will be some interesting material for you, strewn throughout, but probably mostly concentrated in the last few sections. So whether you're a grizzled philosophy of mind veteran, or you're completely new, I hope you'll be able to follow along and find something of value. This isn't strictly and narrowly focused on conceivability arguments, but it all kind of orbits around that topic. So I hope you all enjoy the show today. Just kidding. So before the real video gets started, I wanted to sum up my current view of the zombie argument and try to prevent a couple misunderstandings. So first, I do not think zombies are real, and I don't think they could exist in our universe. The argument does not ask you to believe either of those things. Second, I do not think conceivability indicates possibility in any and all cases. So before you comment with some example where the link between conceivability and possibility doesn't hold, just know that every defender of the zombie argument would happily agree with a very long list of such cases. It is only under certain conditions that we think the link holds. And as for the argument itself, I'm going to read from Non-physicalist Theories of Consciousness by Hedda, Hassel, Mørch, which is one of the three resources that I drew a lot from in this video. Pretty much everything is from Hedda, Hassel, Mørch's book, Non-physicalist Theories of Consciousness, Philip Goff's book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, and Robert Kirk's Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on philosophical zombies. Mørch says, quote, "The zombie argument takes conceivability to imply metaphysical possibility, and correspondingly inconceivability to imply metaphysical impossibility only under certain conditions. Roughly, the link holds only when we are conceiving of the things involved in terms of their real nature, as opposed to in terms of how they superficially appear, or in terms of other contingent, inessential, or coincidental, or imprecise characteristics." So in the video, I give examples of cases where the link between conceivability and possibility does not hold. And I differentiate between different kinds of conceivability as well as possibility. Following Philip Goff, I think conceivability indicates metaphysical possibility in cases where we grasp the nature of the concepts involved. Otherwise, your conceiving isn't worth much. Like, why would I care about conceivability if the conceiver doesn't understand the real nature of the concepts involved? Okay, so what about this case? Well, I would argue that we grasp the nature of phenomenal concepts, because phenomenal concepts are transparent, meaning we grasp their nature in virtue of being conscious. You know the nature of pain by feeling pain, because pain just is a feeling. So you are not blindly pointing at some inessential feature of pain when you reflect on the experience. Interestingly, type B physicalists who invoke a posteriori necessities to rescue their view can't accept phenomenal transparency. They have to embrace the aforementioned blind pointing view. In any event, I think the zombie argument works because conceivability indicates metaphysical possibility in cases where we grasp the real nature of the concepts involved, and this is one of those cases. So zombies are metaphysically possible. Since zombies are metaphysically possible, physicalism is false. So all of this and more will be unpacked in this spectacular video and in the upcoming interview with Philip Goff. So that interview is not happening for a couple months, so you have plenty of time to get your questions in or your devastating objections, but more on that at the end of the episode. So I want to explore one of the most popular arguments against physicalism in analytic philosophy, the conceivability argument. In the 17th century, Descartes argued that it follows from the fact that he could doubt the existence of his physical body, but not the existence of his mind, that the two do not share all their properties, and therefore couldn't be identical. However, most philosophers agree that Descartes' argument from doubt doesn't work, for various technical reasons, but more recent conceivability arguments, that is, arguments that rely on conceiving of the body without the mind, or the mind without the body, along with a link between conceivability and possibility, don't make the same missteps. These days, the most well-known conceivability argument is the zombie argument associated with David Chalmers, though there are versions of the argument that aim at different targets and rely on different theoretical and semantic substructures. For example, they don't all rely on Chalmers' two-dimensional semantics. There have been many attempts to peel apart the concepts of the physical and the phenomenal, and then argue that the conceptual separability of the mind and the body poses a serious and perhaps fatal problem for physicalism. So we're going to get in the weeds today, but first let me offer a clarification for those who don't see how an argument like this could possibly work in principle. My first reaction to hearing the zombie argument years ago was something like, okay, I can imagine the mind without the body, and vice versa, but how is that probative? I can conceive of things that aren't possible. So what? It's not like anything I can imagine is possible. So first, conceivable in this context doesn't just mean possible to imagine. Rather, it means conceptually possible, or can't be ruled out just through reasoning about the concepts involved. This is roughly equivalent to logical possibility. So something is conceivable only if it cannot be ruled out a priori. Additionally, the defender of the conceivability argument thinks that we have reasons for thinking conceivability in the mind-body case specifically is probative. It's not that anything you can conceive of is possible in every sense of the word possible. Approximately 0 people believe that. It's more commonly believed that conceivability is a guide to metaphysical possibility in some cases, and this is one of those cases. Most relevant to the argument is what's called negative ideal conceivability, negative contrasted with positive, and ideal contrasted with prima facie conceivability. So what's the difference between ideal and prima facie conceivability? Well, what's the 27th digit of pi? I don't know. You could throw out any number, and it would be conceivable, in a certain sense, prima facie conceivable, that it could be any of those numbers. But it's not ideally conceivable, because when you actually sit down and work it out mathematically, and keep in mind this is all a priori, it's actually not conceivable that it could be any digit. So I'm going to quote Philip Goff from Consciousness and Fundamental Reality to clarify conceivability. A sentence S is negatively conceivably true just in case it's not a priori that S is false. It's not a priori that S is false. We cannot know a priori that water is made of ectoplasm is false, and in this sense, its truth is negatively conceivable. In contrast, we can know a priori that the sentence, "My Uncle John is a married bachelor," is false, and hence the truth of this sentence is not negatively conceivable. Chalmers also considers a positive notion of conceivability, which would involve positively imagining a situation in which the relevant sentence is true. In some ways, positive conceivability fits better with our intuitive notion of conceivability. When reading Descartes' Meditations, one finds oneself being persuaded that in some sense, one can positively imagine one's mind existing in the absence of one's body. However, positive conceivability is a tricky notion to define as it requires us to get clear on the nature of imagination. In this context, it would be unwise to focus on a notion of imagination closely tied to human mental faculties, as we have no reason to think that the limits of human faculties have any bearing on the limits of possibility. Conceivability understood as some kind of rational coherence is more likely to serve as a guide to possibility, and negative conceivability seems to capture this idea. Similarly, it seems unlikely that the contingent limits of human reason have any bearing on genuine possibility. Ideal conceivability abstracts away from such limits. Ideal conceivability contrasts with prima facie conceivability, where sentence S is prima facie negatively conceivably true, just in case one can't a priori rule out the truth of S upon initial reflection. Square circles are not prima facie conceivable, as it is immediately obvious that they can be ruled out a priori. But consider the following sentence. There are cousins but no siblings. Upon first reflection, one might think that this proposition describes a coherent state of affairs. However, when one thinks about it a bit longer, it's clear that this is a state of affairs that reasoning can rule out, as one's cousin is just the child of one's parents' siblings. Complex mathematical falsehoods, for example 57 times 89 equals 5074, are more straightforward examples of propositions that can be ruled out a priori, but only after a certain amount of reflection. A proposition is ideally negatively conceivable when no amount of a priori reasoning could rule out its truth. The sentence, "water is made of ectoplasm," is thus ideally negatively conceivable. I can sit in my armchair, thinking about it as long as I like, but I'm not going to be able to work out that water is not made of ectoplasm. The sentence, "there are cousins but no siblings," and the sentence, 57 times 89 equals 5074, however, are not ideally negatively conceivable, as sufficient reasoning reveals them to be false. End quote. So here's something everyone agrees on. Sometimes conceivability is powerful evidence for possibility, and likewise inconceivability powerful evidence for impossibility. Other times, it isn't. Nobody actually disagrees with this. The defenders of the conceivability argument do not think that anything and everything you can conceive of is possible in every sense of the word, nor do the opponents of the argument think that conceivability is no guide whatsoever to possibility. There's a lot more common ground here than critics of the argument tend to imply. Let me give a couple examples. It's generally taken to be impossible that there could be an object with shape but without size. The heavy lifting for our justification here is provided by the inconceivability of something having shape but no size. I also can't conceive of a square circle, or an object that's red all over and blue all over at the same time, or a married bachelor, or 2 and 2 adding up to equal greater than 4. Conversely, there are other things that I take to be possible because I can conceive of them. I can conceive of an elephant on top of a skyscraper, so I think it's possible that there could be an elephant on top of a skyscraper, even though I've never empirically tested this and I've never observed it. Even if this had never happened, even if no one in the history of the world had ever observed an elephant on top of a skyscraper, and even if every known instance of elephants confirmed the elephant-no-skyscraper correlation, I would still believe that it was possible. The idea that there's no link between conceivability and possibility is just obviously mistaken. It's worth pointing out that this basic argumentative structure exists in many different areas of philosophy. For example, we can conceive of having a justified true belief without having knowledge. There's an epistemic gap here. We can conceive of one without the other, and from this we infer that it is possible that one could exist without the other. I don't know of anyone who even bothers to question this step. It's clear that knowledge is not justified true belief, since we can conceive of having a justified true belief without having knowledge. The conceivability argument only requires that you believe conceivability is at least sometimes a guide to possibility. Fortunately, nobody really rejects this. Then we need to figure out whether the separability of the mind and body is more like the elephant case, or nothing more than an impossibility that we can entertain in our imagination. The question is not whether conceivability is an infallible guide to possibility. No one thinks it is. Rather, the defender of the argument is going to offer reasons to think the mind-body case is one where conceivability is a guide to possibility, along with innumerable other cases. So, to summarize, the argument does not require one to accept that anything a human being can imagine is possible in every sense. We only care about a subset of kinds of conceivability and a subset of kinds of possibility. We're not arguing that anything positively or negatively conceivable, ideal or prima facie conceivable, is possible in any sense, nomologically possible, physically possible, etc. And that last bit will become clearer as we move along into discussing the nature of physicalism. There's also a crucial piece of the puzzle called phenomenal transparency, which differentiates our phenomenal concepts from other concepts the physicalist might want to appeal to, like water and H2O, to undermine the argument. And not to get ahead of ourselves, but objections based on a posteriori necessity won't work if phenomenal transparency is true. But first, this is an argument against physicalism, so what is physicalism? And for the record, I use physicalism and materialism interchangeably, as most philosophers these days seem to. Quibbling about minor definitional differences seems like a total waste of time. Physicalism is the view or class of views that consciousness is a purely physical phenomenon. Roughly speaking, your mind and your brain are one and the same. Of course, physicalists disagree about the details, and these details lead to different commitments, which become very important when formulating arguments for and against physicalism. And further, physicalists usually at least imply that consciousness came late in the history of the universe and biological evolution. For a physicalist, consciousness is a higher order phenomenon, restricted only to organisms with sufficiently complex nervous systems. as it was put by Hedda Hassel Mørch in her book Non-physicalist Theories of Consciousness. Some physicalist theories hold that consciousness consists merely in some particular type of brain activity or structure. For example, the feeling of love may consist in nothing more than some neural activity involving transmission of serotonin and oxytocin. Others take consciousness to consist in a kind of information processing, or a kind of software implemented by the physical hardware of the brain. End quote. The most commonly discussed alternative to physicalism is dualism, on which human beings are composed of two parts, the body and the soul. The brain and the mind interact with each other and can influence each other, but they're not the same thing. They're two distinct parts of a human being. Physicalists reject the notion that there's any immaterial aspect to you. So, to better understand the physicalist position, let's briefly discuss a crucial premise of Chalmers' conceivability argument. The argument in a nutshell is 1. Zombies are conceivable. 2. If zombies are conceivable, then they are metaphysically possible. And 3. If zombies are metaphysically possible, then physicalism is false. So a philosophical zombie, in contrast to a zombie on The Walking Dead, looks and acts just like us, but there's a total absence of phenomenology. They react to stimuli just like we do, but they have no feelings or experiences, no stream of consciousness. They're just complex mechanisms. If you built a lifelike robot that acted just like Philip Goff, you might be tempted to attribute an inner life to the Goff bot, but you'd probably suspect that any appearance of sentience would be an illusion, and for the sake of argument, let's say you'd be right. The Goff bot would merely register information about its surroundings and react to stimuli, all without having an experience of seeing shapes and tasting the spiciness of paprika and so on. Just like the sensors on automatic doors register information without having experiences that accompany that information. The zombies that Chalmers wants us to imagine are like that. So why would the possibility of zombies be a threat to physicalism? As Mørch explains, the argument presupposes that if two things A and B are identical, or if A is constituted by B, then it's metaphysically impossible for B to exist without A, as influentially noted by Kripke, for the case of identity, and the case of constitution is closely related. For example, if the statue David is constituted by a piece of marble in a certain shape, it's metaphysically impossible, in other words, impossible regardless of what the laws of nature may be, for that piece of marble to exist in that shape without the statue of David also existing. In the same way, if consciousness is constituted by a physical state, as physicalism claims, it should be metaphysically impossible for that physical state to exist without consciousness. End quote. So if the mind is this higher order phenomenon that's constituted by a physical state, then it should be impossible for that physical state to exist without consciousness. That's why the possibility of the physical body without a mind would be devastating to physicalism, but not to alternative views. If a fact or entity X constitutively grounds Y, then necessarily, if X exists, then Y exists also. So if a brick wall is constituted by nothing more than bricks in a particular arrangement, then if we have a bunch of bricks standing in the right relation to each other, then necessarily the brick wall exists too. It comes for free, as it were, once the constituents are in place. Likewise, if consciousness is constitutively grounded in the physical, then it shouldn't be possible for the physical constituents to be in place without the reality of consciousness. There couldn't be a world that is physically indiscernible from our world in which there is no consciousness. This is why the possibility of such a world, a zombie world, would refute physicalism. The third premise of the zombie argument is fairly certain as far as I'm concerned. So are the first and second, but we're getting there. For me, the conceivability argument not only refutes physicalism, but goes a long way towards conveying why physicalism is so unsatisfying as an explanation of consciousness. But let me try to explain my discontent in another way, inspired by Derek Parfit's essay, Why Anything, Why This? Notoriously, phenomenal consciousness, minimally the qualitative what it's like of experience, is a thorn in the side of physicalism. And there are other aspects of the mind that seem problematic for physicalism, including the persistence of personal identity over time, the unity of the mind, the sharpness, non-vagueness of conscious experience, intentionality and meaning, and our capacity for reason. In contemporary analytic philosophy of mind, Accounting for experience is the most discussed problem, and often taken to be the main problem for physicalism. The apparent gap between the experiential and the physical has been dubbed the hard problem of consciousness by Chalmers, who argues that while neuroscience can tell us what's going on in the brain when we're having certain experiences, it can't tell us much more than that. It can reveal which physical states or processes are correlated with a given conscious experience, but not why those correlations hold. For any brain state, no matter how much physical detail is provided, we can always ask the following questions. Why is it like anything to be in this brain state? And why is it like this instead of like something else? Non-physicalists argue that the study of the austere physical realm alone isn't going to answer why it's like something rather than nothing. Just as we can ask why anything, why this, about the universe itself, why is there something rather than nothing, why is there this rather than something else, we can also ask those questions about the existence of experience. Why is it like anything at all for us to exist? And why is it like this? Neuroscience isn't going to answer those questions, any more than physics is going to answer why there's something rather than nothing. It's a distinctly non-scientific question that, nevertheless, does not seem to be meaningless or malformed. It reminds me a bit of the closing paragraphs of Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. Quote, "Even if there's only one possible unified theory, it's just a set of rules and equations. What is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? The usual approach of science of constructing a mathematical model cannot answer the questions of why there should be a universe for the model to describe. Why does the universe go to all the bother of existing?" Oh my god, British people. Why does the universe go to all the bother of existing? Is the unified theory so compelling that it brings about its own existence? End quote. Asking why there's some concrete world for our abstract models to mathematically describe does not seem like a malformed or meaningless question either. It is, however, as Hawking points out, not really a scientific question. Consider the houseplant. Let's assume, along with most people, that plants are insentient. It's not like anything to be a plant. If I study a brain and a plant side by side, I can wonder, why is it like something for this physical object and not that physical object instead? Replying, well, the plant doesn't have a brain, does not answer the question. Why is it like something for this physical object, but not that physical object? Neuroscience can tell us what's going on in the brain when we have certain experiences. It can't answer the deeper question of why it's like anything in the first place. As an aside, how you answer that question, why is it like something for this brain, but not this plant, can say quite a lot about your views. For example, you might have thought something along the lines, well, if you knew everything about that brain, it would be clear why mental activity goes along with neural activity. In fact, you'd see why it was unavoidable. There wouldn't be any gap between the physical and the mental. So in that case, you'd be a fairly radical type of physicalist. Most physicalists these days wouldn't go as far as you. They really don't want it to be a part of their view that there has to be this a priori conceptual entailment from the physical to the phenomenal. For any physical property we can identify, we can still ask why it's like something to be that physical thing. Why couldn't this physical state obtain without any experience going along with it? And as Thomas Nagel famously observed, it seems that no matter how much we know about the brain of another creature, such as a bat who navigates by echolocation, we can't deduce what it's like to be that creature. Strictly speaking, we can't deduce that it's like anything with certainty, but we also can't work out what it's like, even after we grant that it's like something. Relatedly, if you could see a color I'd never seen, there's nothing you could say that would make me understand what it's like to see that color. I would never have knowledge of what it's like to see that color, and neither would a neuroscientist who'd never seen the color. I think that goes a long way to showing that there's an epistemic gap between the physical and the phenomenal. And for most people, physicalists included, there's an intuitive basis for this epistemic gap. The epistemic gap between our knowledge or concept of the physical and our knowledge or concept of the phenomenal plays a crucial role in non-physicalist arguments, like the knowledge argument, explanatory argument, and conceivability argument. These attempt to show that the physical and phenomenal seem like different things because they are different things. There's an epistemic gap because there's an ontological gap. Materialists, since the 80s and 90s, typically try to show that they can grant that there's an epistemic gap without granting an actual ontological gap between the physical and phenomenal. Some materialists still try to argue that there's not even a conceptual gap, but ever since they realized after the Kripke-Putnam revolution that they didn't have to do that, they mostly kind of stopped doing that. So we've been circling around it, but let's talk about what the zombie is missing. What is phenomenal consciousness? As Hedda Hassel Mørch defines it, phenomenally conscious states are characterized by the fact that there is something that it's like for a creature or an entity to be in them, or that they're subjectively experienced or felt. Think of experiences such as seeing red, feeling pain, tasting chocolate, feeling love, or thinking a thought. These experiences may be associated with various functions or abilities, such as perception or reflection, but they also seem to have a subjective quality or feeling to them that goes beyond that. That is their phenomenal aspect. The term phenomenal relates to phenomena in the sense of what immediately appears to us, as opposed to the reality behind the appearances. Conscious states can be regarded as phenomena in this sense because they are what immediately appear to us, and that through which the rest of reality appears, i.e., via conscious perception. The definition of consciousness in terms of there being something that it's like is due to Nagel, 1974, and has been widely adopted in philosophy. As Nagel notes, to say that consciousness is like something is not to say that it merely resembles something. If so, everything would trivially be conscious because everything resembles something else in some way or another. The important point, according to Nagel, is rather that there is something that it's like to be in conscious states for the conscious entity itself. That is, consciousness is subjective in the sense that it's present only for its subject or from a particular point of view. Physical objects, in contrast, are objective in the sense that they can be present from multiple points of view or independently of any point of view at all. For example, different people can see, feel, or otherwise perceive the same chair from different points of view, and we usually think that the chair can exist without anyone perceiving or having a point of view on it at all. Neuroscientist and author Eric Hoel, writing for The Intrinsic Perspective on Substack, writes, quote, "Consciousness is a great mystery. Its definition isn't. In fact, pretty much all the experts agree. There's an unkillable myth that the very definition of the word consciousness is somehow so slippery, so bedeviled with problems, that we must first specify what we mean out of 10 different notions. When this definitional objection is raised, the implicit point is often, not always, but often, that the people who wish to study consciousness scientifically or philosophically are so fundamentally confused that they can't even agree on a definition. And if a definition can't be agreed upon, we should question whether there's anything to say at all. Unfortunately, this argument from undefinability shows up regularly among a certain set of well-educated people, so I'm here to say that, at least linguistically, consciousness is well defined, and that this isn't really a matter of opinion. Most experts, by which I mean the people who do scientific research on the subject, or write philosophical papers about it, or publish books about it, have an agreed-upon vocabulary concerning terms and definitions in the field, which definitely includes consciousness broadly. Another way to say it, if you walk around the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, which brings together hundreds of neuroscientists and philosophers annually to share their research, you will find little definitional confusion over consciousness. I fully admit that this is an appeal to authority, but saying you should rely on the framings of a scientific field, like literally just respecting how it defines terms, is extremely reasonable as an appeal. So what's the agreed-upon definition of the word consciousness? Essentially, it's a definition best given in Thomas Nagel's 1974 famous philosophy paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Quote, "Conscious experience is a widespread phenomenon. It occurs at many levels of animal life, though we cannot be sure of its presence in the simpler organisms, and it is very difficult to say in general what provides evidence of it. But no matter how the form may vary, the fact that an organism has conscious experience at all means basically that there is something it is like to be that organism." Continuing from The Intrinsic Perspective, Nagel's definition is what has gained widespread adoption by those in philosophy of mind, as well as the neuroscience of consciousness. And then he lists off a few neuroscientists and philosophers, going back even before Nagel, for example to William James, who all seem to be pointing at the same phenomenon. He concludes, quote, "So yes, there is scientific confusion about what consciousness is, and there's metaphysical confusion about what consciousness is. But there's no definitional confusion about the word consciousness itself. People know what needs to be explained. It's just that explaining the phenomenon is very hard, and no one fully has yet. Of course, that last part is wrong. I have explained it fully. So as Hedda, Hassel, Mørch goes on to explain in non-physicalist theories of consciousness, the subjectivity of consciousness is intimately connected with the privacy of consciousness. You can observe my brain states, but my subjective states of consciousness are not publicly observable in the same way. There is something about my mental states that no one else has access to in the same way that I have access to them. Quote, to say that one's conscious states are private does not mean that no one else can know anything about them. It rather means that nobody else can know about them in the same direct way. That is, my own conscious states appear directly to me, whereas the conscious states of other people we infer or perceive indirectly through their behavior, verbal reports, facial expressions, and so on. Because of this direct access, many philosophers also hold that our own consciousness can be known with absolute certainty. Descartes famously claimed that we have indubitable knowledge of our own consciousness, and thereby our own existence. End quote. So, before I got into philosophy of mind, I did not realize anyone even tried to deny the privacy of experience. But privacy poses various problems for physicalism, which is why physicalists often dispute it, or say they just don't know what privacy means or something. For me, this is non-negotiable. Not because I'm a non-physicalist partisan. I also believed this was certain when I was a physicalist. I just didn't realize it was in tension with physicalism. But once I did come to see it, I became a lot more confident that physicalism was not true. It's just plain obvious that there is something about my conscious states that no one else can know about in the same direct way that I know about them. So the task is to develop a theory that accounts for this fact. If you can't adequately explain the privacy of experience, then you at least have to explain why phenomenal consciousness seems private, why it gives us the impression of being private. It will not suffice to simply deny privacy, burden shift, or pretend to not understand what's being discussed. So it might have slipped by without much notice, but the concept of phenomenal consciousness we've been discussing involves more than subjective what its likeness. Subjectivity also seems intimately connected with the notion of privacy. I also mentioned ineffability in passing earlier. There's nothing one could communicate to a neuroscientist to fully convey the knowledge of what it's like to see a color the scientist had never seen. Further, conscious experience is something we're directly, immediately acquainted with. So we're honing in on what philosophers of mind sometimes call qualia, which is generally taken as a synonym for phenomenal consciousness. That's what we physicalists think is non-physical. That is what the zombie's missing. If the mind is this higher order phenomenon that's constituted by a physical state, then it should be impossible for that physical state to exist without consciousness. That's why the possibility of a body with the relevant physical states without a mind would critically undermine physicalism. You might even think mere conceivability is a problem for physicalism here. After all, I can't conceive of a piece of marble shaped a certain way without the statue David also existing. Because David is constituted thereof, it's ideally inconceivable for the statue's constituents to be in place without the statue coming along for the ride. It's only a radical form of physicalism that's threatened by the coherence of zombies. What's called a posteriori or type B physicalism can sustain the conceivability of zombies, just not the possibility. So the broader threat is that if the conceivability of a physical body without a conscious mind turns out to be one of those cases where conceivability indicates possibility, then physicalism is false. So there are various lines of argument that attempt to show that zombies are not ideally conceivable, that there's some hidden conceptual problem that threatens their coherence. And on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on zombies, you can see an overview of the various semantic and epistemic challenges that have been offered over the years, but speaking for myself, it's hard to seriously think that any of them could work, if for no other reason than the fact that zombies or zombie-like creatures don't exclusively pop up in philosophy of mind. They're all over the place, and it doesn't seem like anyone is ever tempted to make this move outside the context of, defending physicalism at all costs. If the zombie world is confusing, try to imagine instead a more familiar scenario in philosophy. In epistemology, radically skeptical thought experiments are sometimes employed to make some point about knowledge or justification. In a video on my channel, I used the new evil demon thought experiment to argue that justification is internal to subjects. But sometimes there's simply a challenge issued to make a convincing argument that other minds exist. So let's think about that. So Your mind exists, sure, but do you really know that other people are conscious? And how do you know it's not only, say, 85% of other humans who have an inner life like you do? What is your argument against the possibility that some people, maybe all other people, even though they're flesh and blood human beings, have no inner life as you do? So you might think you have a good argument that other people are conscious, but the odds are that your answer has probably already been thought of and torn to pieces by philosophers. Even if you do come up with an argument that doesn't totally fail, it's still difficult to provide an argument that seems to justify anything like the high degree of assurance that we feel about the existence of other minds. No one seriously thinks that other minds don't exist, or if they did, we would consider that person to be insane. So it should be very easy to come up with a sound argument that just obliterates the skeptical position here. Yet it is surprisingly hard to come up with an argument that seems to warrant the very high degree of confidence we typically have that other minds exist. I love epistemology, so I have to resist pursuing this further. Here, the only point is that it is not incoherent or unintelligible or otherwise conceptually confused to entertain the scenario that some percentage of the human population doesn't have a mind. I mean, it's conceivable that you're the only one. It's not plausible. It just can't be ruled out on the basis of conceptual incoherence. It is not a priori that this is false. In other words, it is conceivable. And if you're the kind of physicalist who thinks it can be ruled out on conceptual grounds, then you should pivot to epistemology and defeat this kind of radical skepticism once and for all. Good luck with that. As long as you think these kinds of scenarios are conceivable, then it's hard for me to see what your issue could be with the notion of a philosophical zombie. Put another way, if you think that zombies are not ideally conceivable, then you think it's not ideally conceivable that the flesh and blood people around you lack an inner mental life. So you're committed to the view that we can solve the problem of other minds and demonstrate that it's not even conceivable that other minds don't exist, so long as we can observe their complex behavior and brain activity. So, given the obvious fact that you can't solve the problem of other minds by pointing to physical behavior in ever-increasing fine-grained detail, I think the conceivability of zombies remains pretty unthreatened by the challenges thrown its way. And predictably, some will just bite the bullet and agree, emphatically, that we can solve the problem of other minds this way. Wow, what a spectacular advantage of the view. But this is where I would Morian shift my way back to sanity. The fact that this is an implication of the position that zombies are inconceivable is a clear liability. If your view accidentally dissolves the problem of other minds with no remainder, then your view went wrong somewhere. As Goff put it in Galileo's Error, the fact that you cannot rule out for certain the possibility that Susan is a zombie shows something interesting. What this shows is that there's no contradiction in the idea that something with the same physical nature as Susan could lack an inner subjective life. For if certain facts about Susan's body and brain were inconsistent with her being a zombie, then you could rely on this fact to prove that Susan is not a zombie. The very fact that there is a problem of other minds entails that zombies are logically possible, in the sense that there's no inconsistency or incoherence in the idea of a zombie. Contrast flying pigs and square circles. Neither of these things exist, but flying pigs have a slight advantage over square circles in that they're at least logically possible. There's no contradiction in the idea of a flying pig. What the insolubility of the problem of other minds reveals is that philosophical zombies are more like flying pigs than square circles. Nobody thinks that philosophical zombies exist any more than they think flying pigs exist. There's no contradiction in the idea of a zombie, and hence if our universe had been very different, perhaps if the laws of nature had been different, there could have been zombies roaming our planet. End quote. One common hang-up with the zombie thought experiment involves laws of nature. Wouldn't a real zombie world require laws of nature that are different from our own? Well, yes. David Chalmers doesn't argue that zombies are nomologically possible. Nomological meaning relating to laws. He thinks that there are laws of nature that would have to be different for zombies to actually exist in the real world. The defender of the zombie argument doesn't need to say that zombies are possible in our world with these particular laws of nature that are currently in place. If your only point is that zombies aren't possible given the laws of nature in our universe, then you haven't said anything in conflict with dualism. In fact, it's much worse than that. Depending on what you mean, you might have said something incompatible with physicalism. Recall that the mere metaphysical possibility of zombies would implode the materialist view. As Philip Goff put it, just as Galileo's thought experiment demonstrated a contradiction in a central plank of Aristotelian physics, so philosophical zombies demonstrate a contradiction in materialism. The question is whether zombies are metaphysically possible. Metaphysical possibility is broader than nomological or physical or natural possibility. In other words, possibility given the actual laws of nature. Metaphysical possibility should not be confused with these. Just because I can conceive of some state of affairs, it can't be ruled out just by thinking about it, doesn't mean it's consistent with the laws of physics. As Hedda Hassel Mørch explains, quote, metaphysical possibility should not be confused with nomological possibility, which is possibility given the actual laws of nature. Clearly, conceivability does not imply nomological possibility, as we can conceive of a number of things that are not possible given the actual laws of nature, such as people levitating, faster than light travel, and so on. But conceivability may plausibly be regarded as a guide to metaphysical possibility. End quote. So, one intuitive way of thinking about metaphysical possibility is in terms of worlds an omnipotent being might have created. If God exists, and if he had so chosen, he could have created a world with a speed of light greater than c. He could not have created a square circle, or an object that had shape but no size, or a world in which 2 and 2 added up to 347. But those cases seem relevantly different from God making a world where the mass of the proton, or the speed of light, is slightly different. Certain states of affairs can be physically impossible, that is, impossible given the laws of physics, but still metaphysically possible, assuming God could have created different natural laws. So remember, physicalists think zombies, as well as color inverts, and certain examples of psychophysical disharmony and the like, are metaphysically impossible. In other words, impossible regardless of what the laws of nature may be, which means even God could not have created a universe with minor adjustments to the psychophysical correlations. They're metaphysically necessary. The non-physicalist, in many cases, will agree that some of these scenarios are not possible given the laws of nature that govern our universe. Physicalists go farther. I think if God existed, it would be within his power to create a color invert, or any number of examples with alternative psychophysical correlation patterns, like making a trombone sound slightly different to us. Physicalists have backed themselves into the position that an omnipotent being could not have done those things if he'd so chosen, because they're metaphysically impossible. So about 50 years ago, Saul Kripke and Hilary Putnam persuaded most analytic philosophers of the existence of what are called a posteriori necessities. Such truths are, as the name implies, not a priori. Despite not being knowable a priori, they are necessarily true. So why is this significant? Well, it can potentially rescue physicalism from Chalmers' horde of zombies. David Chalmers has an organization of different types of physicalism, and they don't all respond to an argument like the zombie argument in the same way. So type A physicalists think that there's an a priori conceptual entailment from the physical to the phenomenal, and this would imply that zombies are not ideally conceivable. And once physicalists realized they didn't have to defend this radical form of physicalism, the majority of them stopped defending it. They flocked to a posteriori physicalism, what would be classified as type B physicalism by Chalmers. So on type B physicalism, there is no a priori conceptual entailment from the physical to the phenomenal, which means it can be granted that zombies are at least conceivable. This is a huge advantage to this kind of physicalism, and it's held by the majority of contemporary physicalists, and may be best expressed by David Papineau, Brian Lohr, and formerly Michael Tye, who's since become a panpsychist. So basically the type A physicalist is not even going to grant that there's an epistemic gap between the physical and the phenomenal, whereas the type B physicalist is perfectly comfortable with an epistemic gap. And of course, they're both still physicalists. They're both committed to the metaphysical impossibility of zombies. But type Bs are going to take advantage of this concept of an a posteriori necessity to defend their view. Okay, so what's an example of an a posteriori necessity in nature? Well, consider water and H2O. And by the way, physicalism, as far as I can tell, is basically the view that the mysteries of consciousness will be revealed through extensive contemplation of water and H2O. So you should probably get used to that. We can't discover through a priori armchair reflection that water is H2O. We have to go out in the world and make observations. According to Kripke and Putnam, it's a necessary truth that water is H2O, but it's one that we discovered empirically. We had to defer to empirical reality to figure that one out. If we imagine a twin Earth where the watery substance in the oceans and rivers is not H2O but XYZ, if it has some other chemical structure, despite sharing its macroscopic properties, then it would not really be water, the thinking goes. The external world plays a role in determining the meaning of our words. By water, I mean that stuff, all that watery stuff that's embedded in my world that falls from the sky and comes out my faucet. If I asked for a glass of water and Twin Putnam somehow teleported over from Twin Earth and, unbeknownst to me, handed over a glass of XYZ, he would be tricking me. That's not water. And honestly, he looks like the type to try to trick me somehow. So after Kripke and Putnam, most philosophers were convinced of the reality of a posteriori necessities. There can be necessary truths, they couldn't be otherwise, but they're not knowable a priori. And of course, we're just papering over a mountain of information. We're not going into any detail into Putnam's arguments or Kripke's arguments, because for our purposes, all you need to know is that this really comes in handy if you're trying to defend physicalism. You can grant the ideal conceivability of zombies. You can grant that there's an epistemic gap. So even though it's negatively ideally conceivable that water is not H2O, the sentence, water is not H2O, is necessarily false. There's an example of a necessary truth that is nonetheless conceivably false. So you can kind of see why physicalists latch onto this. If you're a physicalist and you're trying to defend the idea that necessarily there will be consciousness that comes along with any physical brain and body like ours, you can invoke the idea of an a posteriori necessity. That leaves room for the ideal conceivability of zombies, since it leaves room for the epistemic gap. So if you're a physicalist, the reality of a posteriori necessities is kind of a big deal for you. It's hard to overstate how much of a burden has been lifted off the Type B physicalist, as contrasted with the cluster of Type A views. Non-physicalists burn up a lot of energy trying to establish that there is an epistemic gap in the first place. It's a crucial part of the arguments against physicalism. If a posteriori physicalists can grant an epistemic gap while retaining a physicalist ontology, that puts them in a pretty nice position. It allows them to agree at least part of the way with non-physicalists. That's very good, because we're obviously right about some of this stuff. That's the great promise of a posteriori physicalism. It's the best of both worlds. As Philip Goff explains the Type B view, quote, post the Kripke-Putnam revolution, physicalists slowly started to realize that they had another option. Instead of denying the existence of phenomenal concepts, the physicalist might instead hold that they feature in a posteriori identities with physical or functional concepts. Just as water is a posteriori identical with H2O, so anxiety is a posteriori identical with brain state X. Just as it is conceivable but not possible that the glass in front of me contains water, while at the same time lacking H2O, so it is conceivable but not possible that the creature in front of me instantiates brain state X without experiencing anxiety. Even if we cannot, through armchair reasoning, give a priori analyses of facts about consciousness in terms of facts about causal structure, it may nonetheless be possible to empirically identify facts about consciousness with those facts about causal structure. For the Type A physicalist, zombies are inconceivable. Type B physicalists, in contrast, deny that the phenomenal truths can be deduced from complete knowledge of the physical truths. Despite this epistemological disagreement between Type A and Type B physicalists, as physicalists, both are united in holding that the fact that I'm anxious, and any other phenomenal fact, is constitutively grounded in the physical facts. And if the phenomenal facts are constitutively grounded in the physical facts, then zombies, whether or not they're conceivable, are impossible. Since philosophers realized that Type B physicalism was an option, Type A physicalism has not been so popular. Whether or not there's a metaphysical gap between the pure physical facts and the facts about consciousness, it's extremely plausible that there's an epistemic gap. End quote. It's physicalism that allows there to be an epistemic gap, that denies an a priori conceptual entailment from the physical to the phenomenal. It's physicalism without all the annoying side effects.
Or is it?
As Goff goes on to explain, there is an unwelcome consequence for the Type B view. It doesn't quite deliver on its best of both worlds promise. So the non-physicalist, if they want to defend the zombie argument, needs to reestablish the connection between conceivability and possibility despite the existence of a posteriori necessities. So I'll talk about David Chalmers' attempt to do this, which relies on what's called two-dimensional semantics, and Philip Goff's attempt to do this, which works regardless of whether we accept or reject two-dimensional semantics. According to Chalmers, there are two layers of meaning, as it were, to many of our sentences. We can divide things between the primary intention and the secondary intention, which roughly correspond to appearance and essence. Following Kripke, Chalmers thinks the essence of water is H2O, and that this picks out water across all possible worlds. But then there's the appearance of water, that wet, colorless, odorless stuff that falls from the sky and fills the oceans. For Chalmers, there are two aspects of meaning. The primary intention corresponds to appearance, and the secondary intention corresponds to essence. So in the case of water, the primary intention is basically your experience of water, the appearance of that watery stuff, which would be the same whether you're on Earth or twin Earth. But the essence of water, the secondary intention, is H2O. That's what it really is. That's its essential nature. Within this framework of two-dimensional semantics, wherever the primary and secondary intentions differ, there will be a corresponding epistemic gap between conceivability and possibility. So Chalmers' semantic framework can sustain Kripkean a posteriori necessities, and it can also explain why conceivability would entail possibility in cases where the distinction between primary and secondary intentions collapse. What saves the zombie argument is that the appearance-essence distinction collapses when it comes to experience. When it comes to phenomenal consciousness, there aren't distinct primary and secondary intentions. If you know what pain feels like, then you know what pain is. The feeling is the essence of the experience. There's no way to pry open a gap between how it appears and what it is when it comes to experience. I like how Galen Strawson put it, quote, "When it comes to conscious experience, there's a rock-bottom sense in which we're fully acquainted with it just in having it. The having is the knowing." Philip Goff unpacks it a bit further, quote, "Water is essentially H2O, but we think about it in terms of one of its non-essential properties, being the watery stuff. In this sense, our thought about water is indirect. However, Kripke goes on to deny that this is the case when it comes to consciousness. We think about a pain in terms of how it feels, but how pain feels is not a non-essential way pain happens to appear to us. Pain just is a feeling. In contrast to thought about water, thought about pain is direct. In general, we think about a conscious state in terms of what it's like to be in it. In each case, there's no appearance property to be distinguished from the essence of the conscious state." And he calls this the direct reference thesis. So with all that in mind, we can offer an updated version of the conceivability argument based on two-dimensional semantics. 1. P and nothing has Q is conceivably true. That's basically just the zombie world. 2. If a sentence is conceivably true, and its primary intention is true in some possible world. Conclusion 1. The primary intention of P and nothing has Q is true in some possible world. 3. It is not the case that P and nothing has Q has a primary intention that differs from its secondary intention. Conclusion: the secondary intention of P and nothing has Q is true in some possible world, and hence physicalism is false. So the main problem for this argument is its underlying two-dimensional semantic framework. I've heard it criticized in fairly harsh terms before.
At bottom, David is presupposing a Kripkean modal semantics for modal theory, and my position is about as simple as can be. I utterly reject, and have rejected from the first time I read it 35 years ago, Kripkean semantics for modal logic. I thought it was the dumbest thing I ever heard at that point.
But fortunately, we don't really need two-dimensional semantics to make the argument work. And this is why I've been relying so heavily thus far on Philip Goff's Consciousness and Fundamental Reality. Goff rejects the two-dimensional semantic framework. He thinks the argument goes through as long as we can defend phenomenal transparency. Well, actually, once we defend phenomenal transparency, there's sort of a more straightforward argument that presents itself. Quote, "My worry with Chalmers' conceivability argument is that it rests on highly contentious semantic assumptions, those assumed by the two-dimensional semantic framework in terms of which the argument is posed, which, in my view, Chalmers has never adequately justified. I try to show that what's really needed to make these kinds of arguments work is a commitment to phenomenal transparency. A concept is transparent just in case it reveals the nature of the entity it refers to, in the sense that it is a priori for someone possessing the concept, and in virtue of possessing the concept, what it is for that entity to be a part of reality. A plausible example is the concept of sphericity. For the property of sphericity to be instantiated is for there to be something with all points on its surface equidistant from its center. If you possess the concept of sphericity and you're clever enough, you can work that out from the armchair. A concept is opaque just in case it reveals little or nothing of the nature of the entity it refers to. That is, very little of what it is for that entity to be a part of reality is a priori accessible. The concept water is a plausible example of an opaque concept. For there to be water is for there to be stuff composed of H2O molecules, but this cannot be found out from the armchair. In contrast to sphericity, you have to actually do some science to find out the essential nature of water. Phenomenal transparency is the thesis that phenomenal concepts reveal the nature of the conscious states they refer to. By thinking about a particular pain in terms of what it's like, you can thereby come to know what it is for that pain to be instantiated, and in this respect, the concept of pain is more like the concept of sphericity than it is like the concept of water. So, if phenomenal transparency is true, then our phenomenal concepts give us an understanding of what conscious states are. But if we reject phenomenal transparency and instead hold that phenomenal concepts are opaque, kind of like water, then there's no way we could rule out from the armchair, making an argument like the zombie argument, that they are brain states. For all we know, they could be brain states. I mean, they're opaque concepts, or at least not transparent. So, without phenomenal transparency, there could still be an epistemic gap, as the Type B physicalist maintains. But that epistemic gap would really have no metaphysical significance. It all hangs on whether our phenomenal concepts are transparent or not. So if Goff is right that our phenomenal concepts are transparent and we kind of know what they are in virtue of having them, we can't say, oh, you don't know the nature of pain, you've only had the feeling of pain. Well, pain is that feeling. It's not like water, which turns out to be H2O, but there's still an epistemic gap for us. That's not so with conscious states like pain. You know what consciousness is by virtue of being conscious. The having is the knowing. In other words, once we possess the phenomenal concept, and in virtue of possessing that concept, it's revealed a priori what it is for that entity to be a part of reality. A transparent concept is a concept that reveals the essence of the entity it refers to a priori to the concept user. Okay, so that's a transparent concept. Opaque concepts, as Goff puts it, are kind of like blind pointers, because we're just blindly pointing at that thing, that entity I know not what. So again, the way that this works out best for the a posteriori or type B physicalist is if our phenomenal concepts are opaque, if they're blind pointers. If you want the analogy with water and H2O to really hold, phenomenal concepts can't be transparent. I mean, there wouldn't be an epistemic gap between water and H2O if water was a transparent concept. The case of water and H2O is relevantly different from certain mathematical concepts and, very plausibly, phenomenal concepts. So Goff's claim is that a posteriori physicalism doesn't quite deliver what it promised, physicalism without all the weird side effects. In order for it to really work, our phenomenal concepts can't be transparent. Now there are degrees of transparency and opacity, but it would be best for type B physicalism if phenomenal concepts were opaque, and at the very least, they can't be transparent. The problem is that our phenomenal concepts are definitely not opaque. Now, a lot of physicalists accept phenomenal transparency. They just don't realize the implication. if the essential nature of a concept is revealed a priori to the concept user, and phenomenal concepts are transparent, then if you're a physicalist, neuroscience should be very easy. You should know about the physical basis of all these mental events, because you're a physicalist, so you think consciousness is physical, and you accept phenomenal transparency. You think phenomenal concepts reveal their essence, a priori, to the concept user. Like, just put those two ideas together, physicalism and phenomenal transparency. So the essential nature of a conscious state is revealed to a subject just in virtue of being conscious. Also, phenomenal state X is really just brain state X. That's its essential nature. Okay, well then physicalism plus phenomenal transparency means neuroscience should be very easy. Now, obviously, neuroscience is not easy, which means we can't have type B physicalism and phenomenal transparency. One of those things has to go. That's why if you're a type B physicalist, you're forced away from the transparency thesis, ideally into the position that phenomenal concepts are opaque. They're just blind pointers. When you have an experience, you're just kind of blindly pointing at something and you don't know its nature at all. Could turn out to be anything. I know this has been a very dense episode, but the idea that phenomenal concepts are opaque is incredibly counterintuitive. Arguably, you've just lost sight of the target phenomenon if you think experience is opaque. So it's not that the having is the knowing, it's not that you know what pain is by feeling pain. Even if you have the feeling of pain, you still don't know what it is. You've got no clue about the essential nature of pain, even as you're feeling it. Okay, well that seems wrong. I'm pretty sure the feeling of pain is part of the essential nature of pain. If you want to keep your physicalism on the one hand and your epistemic gap on the other, this is supposed to be what's attractive about type B physicalism, then you have to defend phenomenal opacity. That's how you get an epistemic gap on the type B view. Unfortunately, tragically even, for the a posteriori physicalist, phenomenal opacity is part of the type B package. And Goff puts it in pretty strong terms. Quote, phenomenal opacity is manifestly an implausible view about phenomenal concepts. Surely when I attend to my pain introspectively, when I think about it in terms of how it feels, I understand something about its nature. That's why I care when other people feel pain. Judgments of the moral significance of pain are difficult to make sense of if pain is just that thing I know not what. In knowing how pain feels, I know something of what pain is, and it's this understanding that grounds my awareness that pain is, all else being equal, a bad thing. Type B physicalists often boast that in contrast to analytic functionalism, their view captures our intuitive view about phenomenal concepts. But the view that phenomenal concepts are blind pointers seems to me just as revisionary as the view that phenomenal concepts admit of a priori causal analysis. End quote. So, assuming the truth of phenomenal transparency, we can offer an updated version of the zombie argument, one that relies on a conceivability principle that takes the distinction between transparent and opaque concepts into account. So here's the transparency conceivability argument. 1. P and nothing has Q is conceivably true. 2. If a transparent sentence is conceivably true, then it's possibly true. 3. P and nothing has Q is transparent. Conclusion: P and nothing has Q is possibly true, and so pure physicalism is false. So there's more to the story than this. There's more to say in defense of phenomenal transparency, and about different degrees of transparency and opacity. There's also more to say about the zombie argument after we accept phenomenal transparency. According to Goff, a more straightforward argument emerges against physicalism once we accept phenomenal transparency. So I'm going to be interviewing Philip Goff about the zombie argument, phenomenal transparency, a posteriori physicalism, and the like. So if you've got questions, or need some clarification, or have a devastating objection, then we will answer it. Thank you for listening. I've been Emerson Green, and I'll see you next time.